So what we're going to look at today is our first, true writing assignment as far as a paper goes. And that is going to be this critical appraisal paper. Okay. So all I did was take some notes here from the readings that I asked you to do for today. And so with that, we're going, as I go through how to do the assignment, I will also be referencing the article, and this is the article here, right? And that is in your assignment Dropbox. So if you go to the critically appraised paper, come on in. Critically appraised paper, that's where it'll be. But we have a special guest that has goodies for you. So I will turn that over to you. Okay, so this is the article that we're going to all be doing our critically appraised paper on for this assignment. And so if you think of the critically appraised paper as somewhat of a long form annotated bibliography, you're in the right sort of mode of thinking. The idea here is to create a document that is more useful to us than the article itself. All right, that's the idea. So this is only about a page to 2 pages in total length. So that's nice. And then the main topic is, are the results valid, reliable, and clinically applicable? And that's what we talked about last lesson, and you read about in those readings. So it's divided into these topics here. So the first area, and when you write your paper, do it in a structured manner. So don't make it size 14 font like this, but just put there clinical question, right? And then write about that. Do clinical bottom line and then write about that. We don't need transitions. We don't need any of that sort of nice writing stuff, because the purpose of our writing in exercise science here is to translate information, not to, entertain or really even make it easier. You need to write in complete sentences because that conveys the point, but think more bullet points in nature, right? With that. So do use the column headings. So the first one is going to be pretty much just one sentence, and it's just going to be the question. Now, normally, this would be your clinical question that you came up with that led you to reading this article. But in this case, what led you to reading this article was I assigned it. So we're going to use the clinical question from their article. So from our lesson last time about reading articles and all that, where would we go about finding the clinical question? Introduction. In fact, it's even easier. The clinical question is always, assuming it's written right, the second to last sentence of the introduction. The last sentence is the hypothesis, the second to last. So the purpose of the current study was to determine whether body cooling during exercise in a hot environment diminishes the magnitude of cardiovascular drift, and whether this in turn diminishes a decline in VO2 max. So you just change this from the purpose of the current statement was to determine it to is body cooling during exercise in a hot environment diminished or does, so this is in there, let's go change it into a question, right? I'm not going to try to do this on live TV, so to speak. Change it into a question. It doesn't really matter. Does, change the verb tense, you're good. Right? That's the question. That's the first part. Questions on that? You know, like, don't let me go past if you like don't understand what I just said, because you can watch this again, you know, if you want to, but on Friday, right, you're turning this in, so you won't necessarily have a chance to speak with me again, and I don't want you sitting there, you know, trying to figure it out on your own later. That's not the point of this. Clinical bottom line, right, that goes next, and the reason that it goes next is because it's the most important part. However, we're going to skip over that right now because it is also the last part that you write, because it's going to sum it all up. So it makes sense we can't sum it all up until we've done it. Okay. The next section is the summary of key evidence. And this is going to basically be the results. However, we don't want to copy their results section because that's boring to read. And we also have certain aspects from the method. So these will be results, methods. Right? You can see from your book what sort of things go in there. Right? The number of subjects and the subject characteristics. Brief explanation of the procedures. What outcome measures were included. And then what were the main results. So if we go to the methods section with that, the nice thing is it is also blocked based off of these principles. So it's relatively easy when we're going to describe the sample. In this case, the sample is the subjects. We have 10 active men, right, age, you know, right around 24 plus or minus 4 years, so fairly young active men, right, all with relatively low body fat, and are cyclists and triathletes that average a decent amount of activity a week. So what we would do, opposed to stating this just as this in these sorts of numbers, because this is really boring and this doesn't tell me what I want to know, right? You change that similar to how I was doing when I was describing it to you, right? We have 10 relatively young, active men. Participants also had relatively low body fat. And something, you know, about them being triathletes and participate in either, you know, significant amount of cycling or running per week. And you put that into a nice little couple sentences, maybe a paragraph describing this, so that if I were to ask, you know, like, hey, who was this done on? I don't want to hear, you know, the numbers in particular. I want the categories. Right? I want the general aspect of this. So that makes sense on how we're translating it. So procedures, this is where you can write a lot or a little, depending on how particular it is needed for your procedures. My advice is to read through the methods and try to think of, okay, what did these people do? Answer that question. What did these people do? In this case, you'll see that these people came in on 3 different days. One day was an introduction day, they had an experimental day, and a control day. And so you'll describe that this was a repeated measures, right, multiple day study. Now, the one thing to consider when you're going through with this is we also will be writing about threats to internal validity, right, as well as strengths. So in the section here, where we're talking about the procedures, we just need to describe what basically happened. Because things that are particularly important in the procedures will probably make their way into either a strength or a weakness of the internal validity, right? Because if you think of internal validity, remember internal validity is how well our article is true to itself. And as such, what that legitimately means then is how well were the procedures done to equate to the goals of the clinical question. So for example, right, they performed this exercise in a 35 degrees Celsius, right, 40% relative humidity heat chamber, right? That equates to 95 degrees with relative humidity. That's about 102 heat index, which is right at the very top of the extreme caution zone before they would recommend not exercising. So considering the question was whether or not a cooling device decreases cardiac drift and increases performance in hot environments, the fact that they did it in this heat chamber in these conditions is really more of a strength to internal validity than it is an important part of the procedures. All right, does that make sense? The next part in there is the outcome measures. The reason we include the outcome measures specifically is because the outcome measures will end up being our scoreboard. So when we talk about clinical questions here, when we start to write our own clinical questions, we will talk about this being a game, right? And so the idea of, does this do what it says it's doing? We have 2 teams. We have the control team and the experimental team, but we need a way to keep score. We keep score using the outcomes. So we need to know specifically what was collected, right? The easiest way to do that is to skip most of the method sections and go straight to the instrumentation section. Because in each method's description, right, you're required to report out specifically specifically what you use to collect each measure. So all of these measures are described on how they were collected up above. But in the instrumentation section here, they go specifically through and say, you know, body mass was measured on this electronic scale. Oxygen uptake and cardiac output was measured using this device. And they have all the devices and the manufacturers and all the important things, so you could repeat it. But what it really does is give us a really nice list going through of all the different measurements in one place. You can compare and should compare that to the rest of the methods. Right? Compare to the rest of the methods. But that gives us a starting point. And you can basically turn this into a sentence. You know, the outcome measures, you know, were blah, 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 blah. You don't want just one long run-on sentence. If you look at this study, they really have two different types of studies going on. As you read through, they have more of a physiology-based study, more basic science in nature, and they have more of an application study, which is more performance-based. So maybe in the measures, I would split them there, right? You know, baseline measurements included this, physiological measures included this, performance measures included this. Don't get all crazy trying to like start sentences and organize the sentence in a different way. You know how they like teach you that in English, like don't start the sentence with like the same word or the same phrase or whatever. That's fine here because we're trying to read this quickly to see exactly what we want. So the best way is to say that the outcomes were blah. And so just physiological outcome measures were, performance measures were, right? I mean, that makes it really easy for the reader to find this. And in this case, the reader is really you. The idea is in the future, you might want to read this and see what you can go. So far, so good? So next on there that we're supposed to write about is a brief synopsis of the results. Okay. Now, you obviously go to the results section, and they have what they consider a brief synopsis of the results. But if you ever read results sections, it's really hard to find what you want to find in there. So where can we go to find a brief summary of the results? Guesses? You're right, the tables. There's always tables because they got to report their raw data. And so this is what I do personally. So, right, you got to look at the overall table. Okay? So all tables are formatted about the same, and each table needs to be independent of the text. Two great things, right? So what does that mean? Any abbreviation that they put in their table will always be described below. So I'm first going to look at the description here, and I'm going to see what are the key things that I'm most interested in. And that's what I need to compare. The second thing I'm going to do is I am going to look down at what there's always these kind of asterisks, or, you know, sometimes they have these like weird cross things and all sorts of different measures, but there's some key that's going to describe what are the statistically significant results. So I need to know what are the significant differences, and then what are the insignificant differences that are of the most important outcomes. So what I did here was these little the double asterisk was the significance at the same value of point between the fan condition and that condition. That's what I'm most interested in. All right. These statistical significance here have to do with changes in time within the same condition. Right? That goes and looks to see whether or not the effectiveness of their intervention, right? The idea that, you know, as you exercise, you should show physiological and performance-based changes if you're exercising appropriate intensities, right? But this is what I'm most interested in. So I went through and I underlined the scores for each of those measures. Now I can look, I know that from the stats, these are statistically different. So now what I can do is I can go through, and if I look at this and be easier with like a, you know, ruler or something, but you go across, so stroke volume was higher in the fan condition. Right, temperature of, I believe that's skin, right, it'll be down here somewhere. Mean skin temperature was lower in the fan condition. Temperature B, that's mean body temperature, was lower, right? And RPE was lower. So these are the physiological findings. So what does this tell me? Right? That stroke volume was higher, but other physiological measures were lower. Well, if you know about stroke volume, as well as these physiological things down here, well, let's say a higher stroke volume is a good thing, right? And lower temperatures and lower intensity as far as how hard you're working is a good thing, considering the intensity was set. So they were working at the same intensity, right? We saw that from the methods. And we see that their stroke volume, so they were getting more work done and it was affecting them less. We can then go look at the performance measures. Did the same thing, and you can compare them there as well. So when I'm writing up my summary of the results, I don't need to describe every single one of these unless it's particularly important. I want to describe in general, using some examples, that the fan condition decreased negative physiological response while increasing positive physiological response, while at the same time improving performance. Okay, and then you include some examples from that. It's a lot easier than trying to make your way through all of these, which you can and should, but in reality, we can read the raw numbers, and as long as we see those stats, can make our own analysis. So that is the last part of the summary, right? As far as, you know, the clinical question and the summary of key evidence is going to just be writing what they did. Now we need to start interpreting. Okay, so this is the real part of the paper. This is basically us writing our own discussion. Notice in the discussion area here, I only underlined one line out of, you know, 2 full pages. Why? Because that's this author's interpretation of the results. I'm going to make my own. Threats to internal validity. Again, internal validity is how consistent we are with ourselves, so how consistent this paper is with itself. This is a randomized control trial. You can see it's broken down into different types because there are different aspects. And so these are different things that we should look up and write about. And if you see, this is basically assessed the same, so you're going to do all of these, right? Was there good inclusion and exclusion criteria included, right? Basically, do we know that the individuals that were participating don't have some other weird thing that could be causing these differences? Like, for example, when you read in this paper, you'll read that they did some extensive hydration analysis to make sure that they were adequately hydrated at the beginning of each session so that these were well-hydrated people, so we didn't have hydration being a potential confounding variable. When I say confounding variable, do we remember confounding variable? Right? Anything besides the independent variable that could cause a change in the dependent variable. So that's what we're looking for, confounding variables. Right? Were the data collection methods the same for all the groups? Was the sample group representative of the population? Was there anything weird in the sampling, right? Like where they cherry-picked particular people somehow, some way? Were the outcome measures selective, objective, and appropriate? Right? Are there any other confounding variables that you saw that might have affected that? Right? That they didn't even describe at all? Anything else in there that you think could have messed this up? With a randomized control trial, right? How were participants randomized? So with this, when you go through and look at this, it says that they were randomized, but it doesn't say how. So you could, depending on, you know, how strict you want it, you could consider that a threat, right? Where their randomization procedure could have been, you know, affected somehow, or, you know, it could not. It just could have been an oversight. That's up to you. Was participant allocation blinded, and who was blinded? So when we look at blinding, we're looking at, does the participant know what group they're in? Does the researcher know what group they're in? And does the evaluator know what group they're in? So the question is, you know, did the subject know what was going on? And could that possibly have affected their motivation or their desire or anything like that? Right, same thing with the researcher. In this case, the evaluator was pretty much machines, right? The evaluator was heart rate monitors and rectal thermometers and you know, output things, different aspects like that. So when it's just a machine doing it, you don't really need blinding because the machine doesn't care or know. And so you're going to write about that, you know, do we think that that might have affected the results? That's what we keep asking. It's not just yes or no. It's, do you think this affected the results? Right? So, in, you know, giving you a little hint on this one, right? There's a fan in front of them, right? They know whether or not there's a fan in front of them or not, right? So they are not blinded. Do we think the fan being in front of them changed their motivation or changed their output psychologically, like them knowing that it was there? Did that change? You know, maybe, maybe not. There's no explanation in this that says that they explain their hypothesis to the participants and they randomized the order. They randomized the order, so some people did the fan first, some people did the fan second. So the idea that they have a good understanding of what's going on and somehow would try to be manipulating their data, the participants, probably not, right? That's like, at least I don't think so. You could think differently. However, right, the researchers were not blinded as well. Now, is it possible that the researcher, knowing their hypothesis, by definition as being the researcher, somehow could have provided more encouragement during the fan condition, you know, subliminally, you know, whatever, been more positive, anything like that? Well, that's probably more possible, right? It doesn't say that they tried to control any of that sort of stuff. You know, assuming that they're not, they're not frauds or committing research fraud, they probably didn't do it on purpose, but it's possible that that could have affected that. So that would be a threat to internal validity. The lack of blinding of the researcher would be a threat to internal validity. Questions on threats to internal validity? Is this helpful at all as far as explaining how to do it? Okay. As long as I'm not wasting your time.
So can we just answer those questions in our...
Basically, yeah. But you also get to select what questions you answer. Based on what's important and what you think is important in this article. Exactly. It is exactly that. It is your interpretation of this research. Right? Very much. And that's what you're doing. You're writing your own discussion. Yes? This part, so this goes in order. The sheet that I'm showing you goes in order. Yep. So this goes in order, right? So you start with the clinical question, then the clinical bottom line. But we write this last. So I will talk about it last, but it still goes right here. Yep. And so, yeah, this is you taking what you're reading about and interpreting it for your own use. And that becomes particularly important when we get to the strengths and threats to external validity. If you remember, external validity is also our generalizability. How does this research affect things outside of the research itself? The two main things that we're going to look at here are the inclusion and exclusion criteria and the delimitations. These are choices that the researchers made for doing their research that limit its generalizability. Right, so delimitations are anything beyond this kind of inclusion-exclusion criteria. So if they limited people, or they limited what they measured, for example. Right, so like if this study only did the physiology part, a threat to external validity would be, does the physiological changes affect performance? The one thing I did write down, right, and this is more of a limitation than a delimitation. The difference is not really important and the terms get used more interchangeable than anything else. But they weren't able to measure all of the components of cardiac output and different things. So they know that cardiac output was different, but they don't know why. Right? In all reality, from my point of view, I don't really care why. I care whether or not my manipulation somehow affected the things that create cardiac output. Right? So for me, that's probably not going to be a threat to external validity. However, this study does have one glaring threat to external validity, and that is the extreme homogenic population they studied. Right? These are, the standard deviation. So most of them are 18 to 28-year-old individuals. They are all male. They are all, fairly to very physically active. And they are all of lower body fat percentage. Okay? So the ability of that to be generalized needs to be called into question. So here's where you start to write and you get to come up with your own things with that. Is that meaningful or not? Right? Do you believe that there is something inherently different between those individuals and a greater population, or really this would be your population? So think about whoever you want to work with, right? The idea here is, does external cooling improve performance, right? And this one uses a fan. Some of my research that I've been doing uses wrist bracelets, right? And the idea is, can I improve performance by cooling them? So whatever I'm doing with that, is that a big difference, right? That's really going to be up to you. Right? There are some times that there are obvious differences. There are other times when not so much, the whole, we are more the same than we are different. So that will be up to you to decide. Does that make sense? The last section here is the strengths and threats to statistical validity. Now, as I said, this is difficult without advanced understanding of statistics. So what we're going to do is we're going to allow the reviewers to determine whether or not the statistics performed were appropriate. So if this is a peer-reviewed study, we will assume that the statistics done were appropriate. We are then going to look and say, are the reported outcomes appropriate and were they appropriately used? So the first one being power analysis and p-values. Okay? A power analysis is something that they do beforehand. So both of these are actually going to be set beforehand. So a power analysis is performed to determine how many subjects would be needed to have statistical significant differences at the a priori or beforehand p-value. So basically you're looking, did they perform a power analysis and report it out? And then did they select an appropriate p-value? Now, most p-values are going to be 0.05. That means that in order to say there's a statistically significant difference, we have to be 95% sure that that difference is due to the independent variable and not due to chance. Somebody somewhere someday made up that level as the cutoff point. You can change that, and some authors do. And then you have to determine whether or not that was appropriate. So was their p-value appropriate? You're also going to look, did they report out means, standard deviations, and confidence intervals? And this just describes the specific levels in different ways of each group. All you're going to do is look, did they report them out? Right? And do you believe that they were appropriate? And lastly, did they report effect sizes? Right? And we talked about effect sizes being a way of showing the clinical utility of the difference. So when you look at the strengths and threats to statistical validity, I want you to focus on just these. Were they reported? Right? If they were, call it a strength. If they weren't, call it a threat. Right? Questions so far? Then we go back, and now it's time to write the clinical bottom line. And I love this terminology. Because if you think about like accounting, the bottom line is what matters, right? You know, what we need to know is at the end of the month, do we have more money or did we make more money than we spent? Right? The rest of it is nice to know, but I need to know whether I made more money than I spent. Well, in this case, all of this stuff is nice to know, but we need to answer one question. Should I be doing this? Right? That's what the clinical bottom line is going to be. Should you be doing this? And naturally, you would then explain also why you believe that or not. The why, you know, you can say yes because, you know, it shows great progress, right? Like, you know, this shows that I can increase the workload that people are doing. And so like if I can control temperature, I can increase their workload, thereby allowing more physiological, you know, stresses on the musculoskeletal system that aren't limited by cardiovascular problems, right? If I'm training the musculoskeletal system and not as worried about the cardiovascular system, then yes, that's what I should do. Or no, right? This was such a unique group and such a unique study. It has nothing to do with me, right? I train, you know, I train runners, right? And a 10-mile-an-hour, you know, there's no way for me to artificially create a 10-mile-an-hour breeze, right? They're probably creating some of that on their own anyway. This has nothing to do with me. Remember, we talked about all of these sorts of things, but we're only looking for 1 to 2 pages. And that's probably single spaced opposed to double spaced. 1 page double spaced is like, what, 4 sentences or something, you know, like if you write like me, or 8 if you write normally, right? So you don't need to get too crazy in this. We're supposed to be writing succinctly, right? So the main point on this that is, right, right? Writing shows thought. I don't need to know your thinking process. I need to know that you went through a thinking process and came to unique conclusions. So, the best example, right, is what you don't write. So like in the results here, if you look at this, synopsis or whatever, you could copy this entire paragraph into your paper, right? And you would be reading the paper. But the point is this should be smaller than this. So it's more, what did you take out? What did you not write? What did you focus on? That's what we need. That's what I mean when I say writing shows thought. Okay? I don't need to know how you got there. You add just enough why to justify to yourself, because that's what you're doing, writing to yourself, justify to yourself your decision. So that way, if you went back and read it, you would know why you came to those conclusions. Questions about anything we discussed today? This is due Friday. We do not. So on Friday, so at this class is at 10:30, the paper is due. Assuming the Canvas does what it's supposed to, at 10:30, it will then notify you of the peer reviews you're expected to do, right? And at that point, and I think, let me go into Canvas here. There's some way that it's going to get you that, or you may have to upload it somewhere as well. Let me see real quick. Okay, so when that happens, I will pay attention and make sure it does what it had to. Let me know, it will let you know what 2 students you need to peer review. It should give you access to their paper. If it doesn't, what we will end up doing is I will create a discussion board that you will upload your paper to as well. The peer review is due the same time most of our peer reviews have been due, Monday sometime. 2. Right? And when we do about the peer review, right, goes in there, right? It's your job to provide clear and usable feedback, right? The idea is we need to be building on these as we go. It's not your job to do a rewrite, but point out areas for improvement. This will become more important as we start doing assignments that then will be resubmitted, like they get submitted twice, the draft and then the final one. And you're graded on your thoroughness of your review. So don't rewrite stuff, but give them some feedback with that, okay? And hopefully Canvas will make it so we can upload and everything, but I've never done that before. If need be, what we will do is we will create a discussion board where they will post their paper and then you would download it, make comments using track changes, repost. Okay? If there are any problems on Friday, please let me know as soon as you know of them and I will be there to fix them.